This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 525 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Monday's episode was one of my favorites. When you do research and you have a breakthrough, and when you're as nerdy as I am about this stuff, it's easy to get excited. Unfortunately, I think that excitement may have gotten in the way of fully communicating the idea that I was trying to communicate. If you didn't listen to Monday's show, hit pause and go listen to it. There are a handful of questions today that tie back to the stuff that I talked about on that episode. The key thing that I talked about on that show, though, was how team RB1s in the middle rounds, they tend to hit at a much higher rate when they have teammate running backs also drafted in those middle rounds. So, for example, Chase Edmonds this season versus James Conner. Both are being drafted in the middle rounds, and Edmonds would be the hypothetical player who hits in this scenario. On the flip side, an RB1 in the middle rounds without a teammate drafted near him doesn't do as well, like Michael Carter this year. I had like 10 or 15 people hit me up after that show was published asking how we determine who the RB1 is. And the fact that so many people asked me that means that I clearly didn't do a good enough job communicating this idea, so my apologies. The reason I was so excited about the data was because I'm strictly looking at ADP. The RB1 in all of these scenarios was literally just the running back who was taken first from his backfield. So in the case of Arizona, it's Chase Edmonds. I'm not saying that I think that Chase Edmonds is simply the better running back between the two subjectively. I'm saying he's the player to target in this scenario because he's the first Arizona Cardinals running back being drafted right now. Now, clearly, you're going to run into situations where things aren't that obvious, like with Tampa Bay. There's going to be a back and forth with Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones' ADP throughout this summer. My suggestion in situations like that, though, is that if you're playing in a lot of leagues, you can just target both. It's also fine then to lean into the other aspects that help create a breakout running back that I've talked about for years now on the show, like being a good pass catcher. Fantasy managers are wired in a way where when they hear something like Monday's show and the stuff that I talked about on Monday's show, they wonder what that means for players, individual players in 2021. And I totally understand that. But I would ask you to take a step back and think about what all of this means. Look at it from that perspective first. For example, I got an email this week from David that said, "Hi JJ, first off, love the show. Thanks. It's the only podcast where I never miss an episode. Just finished your new breakout running back podcast and found I got really excited to go through ADP and see who the RB1s are that I should target. However, with such a small sample size, 17 running backs, I wonder if you've done any sensitivity analysis. Like if you increased or decreased the breakout level, how much does that change the results? Also, how much does adding 2020 breakouts change things, and does that mean that we might need more data? Thanks, David." So just to be clear, the 2020 breakouts are part of this data. They weren't removed for the additional ambiguous backfield information that I talked about on Monday. They were just removed when I was talking about the criteria from last year's study. But yes, I did test this. I changed parameters when figuring this out. And as you'd probably guess, as the range between team RB1s and RB2 teammates got wider and wider, the hit rate generally became less and less significant. Now that's at least compared to the running back sample in rounds 6 through 9. That's not saying that we want running backs being drafted back to back like Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones. I'm more so saying that if we just extend our parameters from where we were at, the hit rates did get worse. As the RB2 teammate was drafted later and later, those mid-range RB1s became worse. They had worse hit rates. I would say that there's almost definitely some noise to this data. I'm not trying to package this differently. It's almost impossible for there not to be noise when you're dealing with the average draft position. And the sample isn't massive either. But I'd say two things to that. Number one, the hypothesis here is what strengthens the overall argument, in my opinion. These middle round backfields with teammates being drafted close to one another suggest that we like that backfield situationally. When you get an RB1 who's a standalone RB1 in the middle rounds and when his teammates are being drafted way, way later, it's only logical to think that we don't like that backfield. We seem to know who that player to target is. That's a good thing. But if that's the case, why wouldn't we be higher on that player? Why is he just a middle round pick? It's likely because of situation. So if these two scenarios are situation based, then when one player emerges, it's not surprising that the player who's better off is the one from a perceived better situation. The other thing that I want to note about all of this is that even if you don't want to agree with what I've dubbed the Ambiguous RB1 Theory, which is the least creative thing that I've ever come up with, even if you want to say that the sample is too small for these running backs in the middle rounds who have backfield teammates drafted soon after them, at least fall back on the fact that team RB1s perform better than team RB2s do. That's something that's a lot more difficult to dispute, especially in the middle rounds. In rounds 6 through 9 since 2011, our sample size of team RB1s getting drafted in that range is 81. Team RB2s or worse is 62. The breakout rate is twice as good for those RB1s, for those team RB1s. So at the very least, you can just lump a player like Damian Harrison with Chase Edmonds and say, I'm drafting team RB1s instead of getting someone like James Conner or Raheem Mostert or James Robinson. That's what I'm trying to say here. There are layers to this. I understand this urge and this need to immediately go to looking at who fits this really specific criteria. But we have to play the game a little bit looser than that. These are just general trends that we should keep in the back of our minds as we draft to help us find edges that our league mates may not understand. In most cases, they're going to have no idea that this even exists. And I think at the very least, the data is pretty clear. As drafters, we're pretty good at picking out the RB1 in ambiguous backfields. And as drafters, we should be targeting those team RB1s in the middle rounds as opposed to backup running backs. And you can think of this in reverse too. Maybe you're not excited about the RB1s in those backfields. That's fine. But the data does suggest that the RB2s are bad bets. So avoiding those guys, that may be just as reasonable of a takeaway as targeting the RB1s. Now, I've got more questions about that study on today's show. I wasn't surprised by that because I think it made all of us think a little bit differently about the game, which is exactly what I want. We should be enjoying this kind of thing and trying to find answers and put these puzzle pieces together. And we should do it together. It's more fun that way. So thank you for all these questions in advance. Before getting into those questions though, baseball fans, FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to get involved with daily fantasy baseball with the MLB Home Run Challenge. Each day you can draft 3 players and you'll receive 1 point for every home run they hit. Score 3 or more points for a share of the $2,000 prize pool and score 6 or more points and you'll win a share of the $10,000 prize pool. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and draft your sluggers. Eligibility restrictions apply. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week, or maybe the second question this week, is from @MichaelCarvel. Love the show. Thanks. Yesterday's was very thought-provoking. That's great. Confused if that meant drafting running backs in the dead zone and how to know difference in RB1s and 2s in ambiguous backfields. For 100% clarity, it would be great if you could go into specific details, teams and running backs for 2021. Okay, so hopefully I made the whole point about the difference between RB1s and RB2s clear by now. By RB1, I'm talking about the player who's being drafted first in his backfield. So Chase Edmonds versus James Conner. You're preferring Edmonds because he's the RB1. He's being drafted first. Regarding the dead zone, no, I'm not really saying to draft running backs from the dead zone. The running backs that I focused on came from rounds 6 through 9. As you guys know. The dead zone is really focused on rounds 4 and 5 more so. But even if you include round 6 or round 3, but that doesn't really matter for this study, even if you include round 6, it's not going to drastically change the way that we draft, or it shouldn't. I also went back and tested this. And the same general theory holds true for running backs in rounds 4 and 5. When they have a teammate being drafted in the single-digit rounds with them, they perform better than running backs without that player. In fact, if you look at running backs drafted in rounds 4 and 5 who had a teammate drafted in the single-digit rounds since 2011, the hit rate of a player exceeding expectation by 100 or more points is more than double compared to the alternative, or a running back without a teammate drafted close to them. This suggests that if there are some players who are on that borderline of what I analyzed, so in that round 5 range, and they have a teammate in the top 108 with them, so the first 9 rounds, you can still probably target those players. So for this year, I'm referring to Javonte Williams and Travis Etienne in a lot of cases. And then to your question about the specific backfields, I'd then look into the 49ers and targeting Trey Sermon, and then look at Arizona and targeting Chase Edmonds. Those are really the main examples this season, I think, with Tampa Bay being iffy given Fournette and Rojo's ADP aren't as clear cut. So you're really looking at Javonte Williams, Travis Etienne, Chase Edmonds, and Trey Sermon. It just so happens there are a lot of rookies. That hasn't always been the case. I think it just plays into what I've been saying. We're probably not terrible at judging running back situations. What's scarier from a team RB1 standpoint is when we're elevating the player simply because he seems like the guy in his backfield, like Mike Davis this season. But I also want to say, you don't need to simply avoid the running back dead zone, especially as ADP is shifting. Over the last month, running backs have gradually been drafted later and later, probably because every single fantasy analyst is talking about the running back dead zone. That changes opportunity cost and makes them more attractive, because opportunity cost is a really big piece of this. Given these current trends, I actually think there's an argument to be made that the dead zone won't matter nearly as much in 2021. This next question is from @J50867728. Question regarding the running back breakout episode. The stat you mentioned was they averaged 36 points higher than expectation per year. But does that make them viable? If you go from 50 to 86 total points, that's 5.3 points per week, which is still unstartable. It seemed like an arbitrary number to me. Thanks. Well, it wasn't an arbitrary number because it was being compared to other samples that we were working with. And it was by far the best outcome among all of those samples. But keep in mind that a running back selected at pick 100, he has an expected point value of over 100 points. You guys can read the article that I wrote on this topic called Fantasy Football Introducing the Ambiguous RB1 Theory. I wrote that on NumberFire earlier this week. In that article, I have the running back chart of preseason expectation or ADP versus postseason result. And you can see what a typical middle round running back scores. So at each level or each ADP spot, the expectation for those specific running backs, the RB1s with a teammate drafted close to them, it's raised by 36 points on average. That's how it's been historically. If you had a player drafted at pick 65, that baseline expectation is going to be different than a player drafted at like pick 103. But the average increase is 36 points. We're not using these numbers to necessarily project fantasy points scored. We're using these numbers to see where the best places are to attack in order to find actual league-winning running backs. This next question is from @DrFantasyDad. Per your end of year misses podcast, you identified that Keenan Allen and Stephon Diggs should have been targets and not fades since they were being drafted at their floors basically. Who is being overlooked this year? Yeah, I didn't totally fade those guys last year because I play in enough leagues to where I don't need to fade anyone, but I definitely was underweight on both Stephon Diggs and Keenan Allen last season. And that was wrong and not very great. I did not enjoy that. But what I realized with Diggs, more so than Allen, with Allen, I think it's just a lot aligned for him last year. I don't think he was really being drafted at his floor. He was a miss, but not for the same reason as Stephon Diggs. With Diggs, we were working under this assumption collectively that Buffalo would be this run-heavy team. And Diggs was being drafted as if that was a lock. I think we can look across the landscape this year and pinpoint Tyler Lockett as a wide receiver who's being drafted too low because of the assumption that the Seahawks are going to be run-heavy. Now, people are also not into Lockett because of inconsistency. But there's a lot of variance in something like that. I'm not that concerned about inconsistency. I care more about peripherals and volume. And I think that you could maybe argue Odell Beckham, but he doesn't have the same production backbone that Stephon Diggs had entering last year. OBJ hasn't given us a really strong fantasy season in some time. So there's more of a reason that he's being drafted where he's being drafted, regardless of how run-heavy that Browns team is. And regardless of how run-heavy we think that Browns team is going to be. Lockett, though, is coming off a huge season where he was productive. But he's being drafted as if it's a lock the Seahawks keep up this run-heavy approach. But it's not as obvious as Diggs, at least in hindsight. I understand I'm talking in hindsight, so it's a little bit different. But it doesn't seem as obvious as Stephon Diggs. Because there are other reasons why people don't love Tyler Lockett, like his consistency. Or his perceived consistency. This next question is from @Brennan_Brink. First of all, love the show. Thanks. In a redraft, is it worth stacking your top wide receiver with his late round quarterback like A.J. Brown and Ryan Tannehill or Calvin Ridley and Matt Ryan? I get stacking questions for this show basically every week. I answered it last year, but I'll get it out of the way now so that people can reference this whenever they have that question. There was a great article done on stacking by Mike Leone of Establish the Run last season. You guys can check it out if you Google Deep Dive, Stacking and Season-Long Fantasy, Establish the Run. Essentially, what Leone found was pretty logical. Stacking can be beneficial, but not at the expense of being a suboptimal drafter in a managed season-long league. You don't want to reach for stacks just because you want to stack. And they obviously work better in larger field tournaments. So you should try to stack, but not if it means that you're forcing it. Now, one thing to keep in mind with stacking is that if your late round quarterback ends up hitting, you'll then generally see the players on his team hitting as well. And Leone has data that talks about this in that article. There's a lot of upside from that perspective. It's not just the weekly angle that we think about, it's the yearly angle as well. So I would say overall, yes, you should prefer stacking. That's what the data seems to suggest. Just don't force it. This next question is from @NextManUp101. Can all the ADP-based strategies that you highlight be applied to auction values? Or are there nuances with doing such a translation? Thanks, and loved the breakout running back pod. Thanks. So I did an auction draft strategy episode last season. It was episode 393. That should help with this question and more questions about auction drafts. But I want to at least say that yes, you can use all the principles that I talk about on this show from an ADP perspective and generally attribute that to auction drafts. At the end of the day, the values align to some degree, to a pretty strong degree. It may not be super easy to implement, it might not be super seamless, but you're not playing that drastically different of a game when you're going from a snake draft to an auction draft. But definitely check out episode 393. This last question is from @IglooBrew. Do you think David Montgomery is being drafted too low this year? Going behind Carson, Sanders, Swift, and Jacobs in ADP seems ridiculous, with Fields or Dalton being an upgrade to balance their offense. So it depends where you're drafting, because in a lot of places, he's still going ahead of Josh Jacobs. And thank goodness for that, because he should be going ahead of Josh Jacobs. I'm starting to buy Montgomery more and more, though. I've let it be known this offseason that he's in store for not just regression, but just worse peripheral numbers as well. A lot of the peripheral number stuff was the result of Tariq Cohen coming back, though. And there was a report recently that said that Cohen still hasn't fully healed from his ACL injury. If Cohen's banged up, that gives Montgomery the necessary target share projection that he needs to have a true ceiling this year. The running back environment is more competitive this year than last year, so it's tough to put him that much higher. But if you want to throw Montgomery ahead of Carson or Sanders, I don't think that's illogical. Now, you mentioned that Fields or Dalton would be an upgrade to balance their offense. And while I don't fully disagree, keep in mind that David Montgomery's season last year, as a lot of us know, was sort of split between being very, very average and very, very good. From weeks 1 through 9, he was averaging 12.3 PPR points per game. And Tariq Cohen wasn't there for a lot of that. Montgomery's final 6 games saw an average of 25.7 points per game. That was partially because the Bears' offense was moving the ball a lot better during that stretch. The Bears averaged 30.2 points per game during Montgomery's amazing stretch. From weeks 1 through 9, they averaged 19.1 points per game. So when we're projecting, it's important to not focus too heavily on what went down when Montgomery was super relevant in fantasy. We don't need to fall back to what happened weeks 1 through 9. But even if you meet in the middle, we can't just assume that Dalton and Fields are an upgrade over Montgomery's environment during the final 6 games of the 2020 regular season. Not only that, but as I've alluded to through studies this offseason, having a rookie quarterback and having a mobile quarterback, that's not a great thing for running backs. It's probably not the biggest deal in the world for Montgomery, I'll be honest, but I would lean more that it's a bad thing than a good thing based on history, based on our evidence. So my final answer here is, yes, I think if his ADP stays, which we have to watch, but if his ADP stays, he's a value given this Cohen news. I just don't know if you can get that much higher than like RB14 or RB15 with David Montgomery. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.